August 21st, 1911, 7 a.m., the Louvre Museum, Paris. In 6 hours, the world's most famous painting will vanish. Right now, Vincenzo Peruggia is walking through the staff entrance, wearing the same thing he wore every day for 3 years, a white painter's smock. No one will stop him. No one will question him. Because in the most secure museum on earth, the man who's about to commit the greatest art theft in history looks exactly like he belongs there. This is the story of how a 30-year-old Italian handyman walked out of the Louvre with the Mona Lisa, and how his delusions of patriotism collided with a museum that had grown complacent with its own legend. Vincenzo Peruggia was born in 1881 in Dumenza, a village in the Italian Alps near Lake Maggiore, where stone houses cling to hillsides and work means construction, masonry, or leaving. He chose leaving, joining the wave of Italian laborers flooding into France in the early 1900s, men with skills in glass cutting, carpentry, painting. The invisible workers who maintained Europe's grandest buildings. By 1908, Peruggia had settled in Paris, working odd jobs in construction and painting, living in a cramped apartment on the Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis in the 10th arrondissement, unremarkable in every measurable way. That same year, the Louvre hired a contracting company called Corbière et Fils to install protective glass cases over its most valuable paintings, and Peruggia was brought on as a glazier, someone who cuts, fits, and installs glass. The job gave him something most criminals could never obtain: legitimate, documented access to every gallery in the museum, the authority to move freely through restricted areas, and the muscle memory of where guards stood and when they changed shifts. And Peruggia was observant in the way that invisible people often are, noticing not just the paintings he was protecting, but the systems meant to protect them. And more importantly, the assumptions those systems were built on. The Louvre in 1911, 445 rooms, 35,000 objects, 150 guards, for a building covering 60,000 square meters. But the real vulnerability wasn't the ratio of guards to space. It was something more fundamental. The Louvre closed every Monday for cleaning and maintenance, which meant the galleries were full of workers in smocks, carrying tools, moving through spaces that were normally off limits. On Mondays, the museum belonged to the maintenance staff, and guards had learned to ignore men in white smocks the same way you'd ignore furniture. They were part of the architecture, expected, unremarkable, functionally invisible. In October 1910, Peruggia had been assigned to install protective glass over the Mona Lisa herself, spending hours in the Salon Carré handling the painting, lifting it, measuring the frame, studying the hooks that held it to the wall. What happened in his mind during those hours remained speculation, but something shifted. Whether it was the casual way curators discussed the painting's Italian origins, or the resentment of a laborer handling treasures he could never own, or something darker and more calculated. Peruggia would later claim he stole the Mona Lisa to return it to Italy, to correct Napoleon's theft and restore Italian cultural patrimony, a narrative that painted him as a patriot rather than a thief, noble rather than opportunistic. There was just one problem with his patriotic story. Leonardo da Vinci had brought the Mona Lisa to France himself in 1516, selling it to King Francis I. Napoleon had nothing to do with it, and the painting had been legally French for nearly 400 years, which raises the question that would haunt the entire case. Did Peruggia genuinely believe his own nationalist justification, constructing an elaborate delusion to rationalize theft? Or was the patriotism story simply cover for a more mundane motive like profit? The evidence suggests both might be true simultaneously. In the months before the theft, Perugia had contacted art dealers asking about selling Italian paintings, had researched the Mona Lisa's history, and had made suspicious inquiries about international art markets. He was also prone to violent outbursts, had been arrested multiple times for minor assaults, carried a knife habitually, and displayed the kind of grandiose thinking common in people who feel invisible. The belief that one dramatic act could rewrite their entire narrative. But Perugia's psychology mattered less than the Louvre's complacency, because by 1911 the museum had settled into a dangerous assumption that its reputation alone provided security, that criminals wouldn't dare attempt theft from such a legendary institution. The Louvre did have an electric alarm system installed in 1907, with contacts on major artworks that would trigger bells if paintings were removed from walls. But the system had a critical flaw that everyone who worked there knew about. It didn't work on Mondays. The entire system was shut down during maintenance day. Too many false alarms from workers moving frames, testing connections, cleaning walls. So every Monday, the museum was effectively unalarmed. Perugia's plan, such as it was, relied on this window of vulnerability, combined with his legitimate presence. But calling it a plan might be generous, because what he was about to attempt had almost no contingency for failure, no escape route, no consideration of what happened after he left the building. In the days before August 21st, Perugia made several reconnaissance visits to the Louvre, timing guard movements, confirming that Monday morning remained the quietest period, that the Salon Carré would be empty between 7 and 9 a.m., before photographers arrived to document paintings. He also recruited two other Italian workers, the Lancelotti brothers, though their exact role remains murky. Whether they were genuine accomplices, lookouts, or simply confused friends who thought they were helping move furniture during a legitimate job. On Sunday night, August 20th, 1911, Perugia likely didn't sleep much, because what he was planning required not just nerve but physical endurance. The Mona Lisa's frame with protective glass weighed approximately 200 pounds, and he'd have to carry it alone through multiple galleries and stairwells. Monday morning, 7 a.m. Perugia entered through the staff entrance on the Quai du Louvre, showing his workers pass, nodding to the guard who'd seen him dozens of times before. Just another maintenance man arriving for another Monday shift in the endless routine of institutional upkeep. He had roughly 90 minutes, 7 to 8:30, before the photography team arrived in the Salon Carré. 90 minutes to remove the painting, extract it from the frame, hide the evidence, and walk out. The clock had already started. Perugia moved through the corridors he'd walked hundreds of times before, past guards who didn't look twice, carrying nothing unusual. Because the genius of his approach, if it can be called that, was that he'd steal the tools he needed from inside the museum itself. The Salon Carré sits at the heart of the Louvre's Italian paintings collection, a square room with red damask walls and a skylight that floods the space with natural light. And on this Monday morning, it was completely empty, except for the paintings themselves. The Mona Lisa hung between two doorways on the west wall, approximately 5 feet off the ground, mounted on 4 brass hooks that Perugia himself had installed the previous October, which meant he knew exactly how the painting would live free, how much force the hooks required, where his hands needed to grip. The Lancelotti brothers arrived around 7:15, finding Perugia already in the Salon Carré. And what happened next depends on which version of events you believe, whether they actively helped remove the painting or simply stood watch, confused about what job they'd actually been recruited for. 7:23 a.m. Perugia lifted the Mona Lisa off its hooks. 200 pounds of wood, glass and canvas. The alarm system, disabled for maintenance, stayed silent. Not a bell, not a signal, nothing. The original plan, as far as one existed, was to carry the painting to a service staircase at the northeast corner of the building, descend to the ground floor, and exit through a door that maintenance workers used regularly. A route Perugia had walked countless times, anonymous and unremarkable. But carrying a 200-pound painting through corridors, even empty ones, created risk, so Perugia made a decision that revealed either remarkable sang-froid or complete panic. He ducked into a small service stairwell, propped the painting against the wall, and began dismantling it with tools he'd taken from a maintenance closet. The protective glass came off first, then the outer decorative frame, revealing the poplar wood panel that Leonardo had painted on 4 centuries earlier. And this was the technical challenge nobody had anticipated, because removing the Mona Lisa from its elaborate Renaissance frame without damaging the delicate wood required precision that Perugia, as a glazier, actually possessed. 15 minutes. That's how long the extraction took. When he was done, the Mona Lisa herself, the actual painted panel, weighed just 18 pounds, small enough to wrap in his white smock, light enough to carry under one arm. But now, Perugia had a new problem. 200 pounds of ornate frame and protective glass sitting in a stairwell. Physical evidence that couldn't be explained away as routine maintenance, too heavy to carry, too distinctive to hide effectively. He covered the frame pieces with a drop cloth that had been left in the stairwell, a gesture more superstitious than practical, buying minutes rather than hours. And then he started down the stairs toward the exit that would take him from museum worker to international fugitive. 8:07 a.m. Perugia reached the ground floor service door, turned the handle, locked. The door that stayed unlocked every Monday for maintenance access was locked. 61 minutes after entering the museum, his escape route had vanished. What went through his mind in that moment remains speculation. Whether he considered abandoning the painting, returning it to the Salon Carré, inventing a story about finding it in the stairwell. But instead, he did something that revealed either stupidity or desperate courage. A plumber named Sauvé was working on radiator repairs in the basement and heard someone rattling the door handle, calling out in accented French. So Sauvé climbed the stairs, found a man in a white smock holding a bulky package, and simply assumed this was another worker locked out by accident. Sauvé unlocked the door from the inside, and Perugia thanked him in Italian accented French, offered him money for the trouble, which Sauvé refused, because helping a fellow worker was simply what you did, the small courtesies that made institutional life bearable. 8:11 a.m. Perugia walked out of the Louvre, through the service exit, into the morning streets of Paris, carrying the world's most famous painting wrapped in his work smock. And nobody stopped him. Nobody even looked. The painting wouldn't be reported missing for another 17 hours, because the assumptions that enabled the theft also delayed its discovery. When the Mona Lisa's empty space was first noticed at 9:30 a.m., the immediate assumption was that photographers had taken it to their studio for documentation. When the photography studio denied having the painting, curators assumed the conservation department had taken it for restoration. When conservation denied this, they assumed administrative records were wrong. Each department passing responsibility until someone finally checked the service stairwell and found 200 pounds of ornate frame under a drop cloth. 1:07 p.m. 24 hours had passed. The Louvre's director, Théophile Homol, was vacationing in the south of France. a telegram reached him that afternoon. 4 words: La Joconde a disparu. The Mona Lisa has disappeared. The museum was immediately closed, not to reopen for a week, while 60 detectives from the Paris Prefecture of Police moved through the galleries like archaeologists at a crime scene, photographing, measuring, questioning every guard and employee who'd worked Monday morning. The evidence trail was almost comically clear. The abandoned frame, the screwdriver left in the stairwell, a single thumbprint on the protective glass that would later prove crucial. But the Paris police in 1911 were more accustomed to crimes of passion than art theft, and their initial theories reflected this confusion. The lead investigator, Chief Inspector Louis Lepine, initially believed the theft must have been committed by a sophisticated international syndicate, because surely no individual criminal would have the audacity or access to steal from the Louvre, completely missing the point that audacity plus access was exactly what Perugia possessed. 57 people. That's how many maintenance workers had access to the Louvre that Monday. 57 names to interview, 57 alibis to verify, and one of them, Vincenzo Perugia, was about to make his first critical mistake. On August 23rd, 2 days after the theft, Perugia was questioned at his apartment on the Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis, and he performed brilliantly, playing the confused Italian laborer, showing police his work records, expressing shock that anyone would steal from the museum, even offering to help with the investigation. The police took his thumbprints for elimination purposes, noted his small apartment and working-class circumstances, and concluded he wasn't sophisticated enough to be involved in an international art theft syndicate, which was simultaneously an accurate assessment of his sophistication and a completely wrong conclusion about his guilt. Meanwhile, in that same cramped apartment, wrapped in cloth and hidden inside a trunk with a false bottom that Perugia had constructed himself, the Mona Lisa was resting 5 feet below where the police stood, which raises the question of whether Perugia was exceptionally lucky or whether he'd planned this contingency all along. By August 24th, the theft had become international news, with headlines from London to New York, treating the loss as cultural apocalypse. The New York Times called it the greatest art theft in history, which was both accurate and slightly premature, since nobody yet knew whether this was theft or destruction. When the Louvre reopened on August 29th, thousands of Parisians queued to see not the museum's remaining masterpieces, but the empty space on the Salon Carré wall where the Mona Lisa had hung. A collective act of mourning for a painting most visitors had previously walked past without stopping. The irony was that the theft made the Mona Lisa far more famous than she'd been before. Prior to 1911, Leonardo's portrait was respected by art historians, but hardly a household name. Just one masterpiece among thousands. But the theft transformed her into an icon of cultural value itself. Over the following months, the Paris police pursued dozens of false leads. A stolen painting spotted in Buenos Aires turned out to be a copy. A mysterious American collector supposedly buying stolen European art proved to be invention. And a spiritualist medium claiming to have located the painting through psychic vision wasted weeks of investigative time. And through it all, Vincenzo Perugia continued his life with remarkable normalcy, working odd painting jobs, living in his small apartment, occasionally taking the Mona Lisa out of her trunk to look at her, waiting for the moment when he could safely convert history's greatest art theft into the fortune he believed he deserved. For 2 years, Vincenzo Perugia lived with the Mona Lisa hidden in his apartment, a period that revealed more about his psychology than the theft itself, because a purely rational criminal would have destroyed the painting or attempted to sell it quickly, cutting losses and escaping. But Perugia did neither. He would later testify that he took the painting out occasionally to look at her, studying Leonardo's brushwork, imagining the reception he'd receive when he finally returned her to Italy. A fantasy that combined genuine reverence for art with complete inability to understand the legal and practical impossibility of his plan. By early 1913, the investigation had effectively stalled, with Chief Inspector Lepine publicly admitting that the trail had gone cold, that the painting might never be recovered, that it could have been destroyed by thieves who realized they couldn't sell the world's most recognizable artwork. But Perugia's financial situation was deteriorating, because odd painting jobs barely covered rent, and the painting hidden in his trunk represented millions of francs that he couldn't access. Wealth that existed only in potential, mocking him through its very proximity and complete uselessness. November 1913. 2 years, 2 months, 11 days after the theft, Perugia made contact. An art dealer in Florence named Alfredo Gheri, a letter signed with the alias Leonardo. The offer was simple: the Mona Lisa for 500,000 lire. Alfredo Gheri was a respected dealer in Renaissance art, which meant he immediately recognized that any letter offering the Mona Lisa was either elaborate fraud or the opportunity of a lifetime. And being a businessman first, he responded with cautious interest, asking for proof that the painting was genuine. Gheri also contacted Giovanni Poggi, the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, because authenticating the world's most famous painting required expertise that could distinguish Leonardo's original from the dozens of copies that had circulated for centuries, and because Gheri suspected this might require police involvement. On December 10, 1913, Perugia boarded a train from Paris to Florence, carrying the Mona Lisa wrapped in red silk inside a wooden trunk, traveling third class because despite possessing a painting worth millions, he could barely afford the ticket. A detail that captures the entire absurdity of his situation. He checked into the Hotel Tripoli Italia under his real name, which suggests either supreme confidence or complete inability to grasp operational security. And on December 11th, Alfredo Gheri arrived at the hotel to inspect what this mysterious Leonardo claimed was the genuine Mona Lisa. In room number 20, Perugia pulled the trunk from under his bed, opened it, removed layers of cloth, and revealed Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Lisa Gherardini, poplar wood panel measuring 30 inches by 21 inches, slightly cracked from age but unmistakably authentic, the most famous missing artwork in the world, sitting on a cheap hotel bed. Gheri examined the panel, the wood grain, the craquelure patterns in the paint, the Louvre inventory stamps on the back. Every detail matched. This was her, the real Mona Lisa, in a Florence hotel room, being offered for sale by an Italian handyman. Gheri told Perugia the painting needed to be examined by Giovanni Poggi at the Uffizi to confirm authenticity before payment could be arranged. A reasonable request that Perugia accepted because he genuinely believed he was conducting a legitimate transaction, returning stolen Italian art to its rightful homeland, a patriot completing his mission. On December 12th, Perugia carried the Mona Lisa to the Uffizi Gallery, where Poggi conducted a careful examination in his office, comparing the panel to archival photographs, measuring dimensions, studying the crack patterns that had been documented in Louvre conservation records, confirming beyond any doubt that this was Leonardo's original. Poggi excused himself, went to his telephone, called the Florence police. 20 minutes later, officers entered the Uffizi through the staff entrance, found Vincenzo Perugia in Poggi's office, still waiting to negotiate price, still believing he was a patriot about to receive gratitude. Perugia's reaction to arrest was reportedly one of complete bewilderment, asking repeatedly why he was being detained when he'd done nothing wrong, when he'd returned stolen Italian property to Italy, a delusion so complete that police initially thought he might be mentally incompetent, rather than simply delusional. The 90-minute window from 2 years earlier had finally closed, not through capture during escape, but through Perugia's own decision to emerge from hiding, his patience outlasting the investigation, but his delusion ultimately ensuring the same result that immediate capture would have achieved. Within hours, the French government was notified. Diplomatic cables flew between Paris and Florence, and the painting that had vanished from the Louvre on a Monday morning in August 1911 was now officially recovered and held as evidence in an Italian police station, creating immediate questions about jurisdiction and repatriation. The Italian public's initial reaction was euphoric celebration, with newspapers praising Perugia as a hero who'd returned stolen Italian patrimony, crowds gathering outside the Florence police station chanting his name, a nationalist fervor that complicated both French diplomatic efforts and Italian prosecutors trying to build a criminal case. Before being returned to France, the Mona Lisa was briefly displayed at the Uffizi Gallery, where an estimated 30,000 Italians queued to see Leonardo's masterpiece on what they believed was her rightful home soil. A public viewing that transformed criminal evidence into nationalist trophy, at least temporarily. On December 31st, 1913, after diplomatic negotiations and Italian government assurances, the Mona Lisa was transported back to Paris in a sealed railway car with armed guards. And on January 4th, 1914, she was rehung in the Salon Carré, returning to the empty space that had become more famous than the painting itself. Perugia's trial in Florence began in June 1914, and his defense strategy revealed the same nationalist delusion that had motivated the theft. His lawyer argued that he'd acted from patriotic duty, that he deserved gratitude rather than punishment, that the real crime was France's possession of Italian art. Prosecutors demolished this defense by presenting the historical record. Leonardo had brought the Mona Lisa to France voluntarily, had sold it to Francis I for 4,000 gold écus, and the painting had been legally French property for 4 centuries, making Perugia's nationalist justification not just wrong, but absurdly, demonstrably wrong. The prosecution also presented evidence that contradicted Perugia's patriot narrative. His contacts with multiple art dealers before the theft, his 500,000 lire asking price, his complete lack of involvement in any patriotic organizations, suggesting that nationalism was retrospective justification rather than original motive. The truth, like most human motivation, was probably layered. Perugia likely believed his own patriotic story while simultaneously planning to profit, constructing a narrative that allowed him to be both hero and thief, patriot and criminal. A psychological compartmentalization that let him live with the painting for 2 years without apparent guilt. The verdict: guilty of theft. Sentence: 1 year, 15 days in prison. Reduced on appeal to 7 months. Time served during trial. Immediate release. Vincenzo Perugia walked out of the Florence courthouse a free man, having served less time than the painting spent hidden in his trunk. Perugia returned to France, served briefly in the Italian army during World War I, eventually settled back in the Paris area, working as a painter and decorator, married, had a daughter, living out his remaining decades as the man who'd stolen the Mona Lisa and somehow gotten away with it, at least partially. The theft's lasting impact wasn't on Perugia, but on the Mona Lisa herself, because the 2 years she spent missing transformed her from respected Renaissance portrait into global icon. The theft created mystique that artistic merit alone never could, proving that cultural value is constructed as much by narrative as by brushwork. The Louvre's security was comprehensively overhauled after 1913. Alarm systems that actually functioned on Mondays, mandatory sign-in procedures for all workers, guards posted in previously empty galleries, the recognition that reputation alone provides no security, and that invisibility can be a criminal's greatest asset. And somewhere in the historical record sits Sauvé, the plumber who unlocked a door for a fellow worker on a Monday morning, enabling the greatest art theft in history through a small act of collegial kindness. His name preserved forever as the man who accidentally facilitated the impossible. August 21st, 1911, 7 a.m., the Louvre Museum. A man in a white smock walking through the staff entrance. The painting vanishes not because security failed, but because someone who looked like he belonged there decided to take what he believed was his. And for 90 minutes, nobody questioned it. And that's where we'll leave it. Thanks for listening and diving into this incredible story. If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries like this, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And see you in the next one.